All right, let's get back to space. So this is a very important time period in American history, arguably one of the more important time periods, maybe the Great Depression, World War II, um, and this last decade post-financial crisis leading up to this current event. Um, are some of the more important and recent memories. But the 60s, a lot of stuff was happening at the time, including the Vietnam War, which I'm sure you've talked about in some of your classes. But the Vietnam War was, the American involvement may have been a little over a decade or more than a decade, but in Vietnam, it looked like it was going on for quite a while, right? So there's a long history of the United States in Vietnam. Uh, Wilson, president in 1913, refused petition for Vietnam to be to acknowledge it as independent, and FDR, when he was president, declined French requests to help them maintain their control, their imperialist ambitions in Vietnam, because the France had spent quite a bit of time and capital and French lives there to try to control it. So in 1945, there is a revolution, and the Japanese who are in control allow Ho Chi Minh to take over this area that gets to be known as North Vietnam. And the communists, seeing sympathetic ideologies, start helping. So Truman, as we talked about in one of the earlier videos, had the Marshall Doctrine, which was to try to stop communism from spreading around the world. Gave money to France to support them in their imperialist ambitions, and even sent a few troops. But within a couple of years, the French lost in Vietnam. And then the Vietnamese started killing thousands to try to reunify this, well, what they called reunifying Vietnam under their control. So they invaded Laos and they started taking control. Kennedy started ramping up and sending some troops, but this really starts taking hold when Johnson is in charge. And Johnson weirdly felt compelled to go into Vietnam, so he started sending more and more troops, and eventually there was a draft which was so unpopular that Johnson decided not to run for re-election. We'll get to that soon. In any case, the war in Vietnam seems to just be ongoing and just a dead zone, a horrible place for lots of US troops to go on or to go to and die. Essentially, they were just trying to stop communism from spreading. But the public turned against it pretty early on, a couple of years into it. And it was very, very, very largely unpopular. So, okay. Eventually, Nixon wins re-election with his secret plan to leave Vietnam with dignity and peace. He doesn't do it, but he has the exact same message and is re-elected with his doubly secret plan. And then he actually does help start withdrawing some troops. So eventually the United States leaves. North Korea completes their attack and conquers South Vietnam, thus essentially being the first of, well, not even the first, one of many losses that the United States suffers in war after World War II. I remember the first time somebody described Vietnam as a loss to me. I was just studying in Australia, and it freaked me out. I was like, no, we didn't lose. We didn't lose. Because they never taught me that we had lost the war. But it's hard to say that we did anything but lose, and horribly. And it's unclear for what anymore. If you're not afraid of communism. Anyway. So the Vietnam War is going on in the background here. There's also quite a few social changes. We talked about all of these in the previous video. And then in the 1960s, there are many more social changes. So I've color-coded racial issues in blue and gender issues in green. It's kind of like an olivey green and kind of like a gunmetal blue. So 1961, there's the Freedom Riders, a group of, I forget if it's 6 or 7 Black people and 7 or 6 white people, but they're beaten, firebombed, arrested. That makes international news. And in fact, the American treatment of African Americans is a huge embarrassment. Whenever the United States tries to say anything to the Soviet Union about their use of gulags, they famously reply with a what philosophers call an ad hominem to Coke, what has recently been called a whataboutism, but it's this phrase which you can Google, and you are lynching Negroes. The treatment of Black people largely across the South was, but also in the North of the United States, was a major international issue. There were diplomats that could not be seated in restaurants when they came to Washington, D.C. Like prime ministers of India, like there are many like major issues that happen because of segregation. It's very embarrassing internationally. In 1963, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and several other, well, thousands of other people march on Washington. That same year, the Equal Pay Act is passed in Congress, which promises equitable wages for equal work in federal employment. And The Feminine Mystique is published. This, a lot of people think, kickstarts the second wave of feminism, which is the push for equality. 1964, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, and then in 65, he signs the Voting Rights Act. He tells Martin Luther King Jr. to make as much noise as possible. He needs to be forced to do it. And this is one of those moments in American history which is fascinating when you look at it in the long sweep of time, right? Like up until this point, the Republican Party had been the party of Lincoln. They had lost a lot of support from African Americans throughout the New Deal. It was unclear. Well, I mean, they arguably should have lost it before in the 1920s when the Republican Party was trying to push for a second Gilded Age. But the Republican Party and the Democratic Party still had roughly equal vote shares among Black people in the 1960s and among white people. In fact, you could not tell the difference demographically between the two now. Even now, I mean, there's big demographic differences among African Americans, but the other demographic differences between the vote share of Republicans and Democrats is not as robust. But the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which Johnson pushes through Congress, and in fact, like 80% of the votes come from Republicans in the House and Senate. Very few Democrats are in favor of it because at this point, there really are 4 parties. They just happen to be located within 2 parties. And in fact, this is a point in history where parties are not ideological. There were liberal Republicans that were more liberal than most liberal Democrats, and there were conservative Democrats that were more, well, pro-segregation than most Republicans. Dixiecrats. So after the Civil Rights Act, Johnson remarks that he thinks he has given the South to Republicans for a long time to come. And in fact, in 1964, when he's running for re-election, the candidate that runs against him on the Republican side was one of the candidates that had voted against the Civil Rights Act, thus solidifying the support of the white Dixiecrats in the South. So there's lots of civil unrest. Bloody Sunday. Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, and the Fair Housing Act is passed. I think 68 is probably the most important election of our lifetimes up until 2016, in living memory anyway. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And Johnson passes executive order limiting sex discrimination. Other big changes, right? So in 1960, 11% of the United States is non-white. Currently, it's nearly 4 times as much. And that has to do with the previous screen, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, immigration aspects of those acts meant that the United States completely overturned its 1924's eugenics laws, which prevented immigrants from heavily restricted immigration from non-white countries. The Soviet Union was more diverse than the United States during this period, but is currently much less diverse. And the ethnic group differences there, I think, would be foreign to us here. So there are many waves of people leaving the Soviet Union. And similarly, the United States also has many waves of people entering the United States. There's immigration waves from various countries, Koreans during the Korean War, Cuban waves. There's lots of Latinos that came over, and then under the Bracero program, my grandfather did, and then sent back during Operation Wetback. My grandfather went back for family reasons. Latinos came back in the 1980s, which is when my parents came back. But yeah, so the 1924 Act, the 1952 Act, the limited immigrations. There are a couple of these heavily eugenics-based acts, which were overturned in the mid-60s. When it comes to gender, the Soviet Union was very far ahead of the United States, not so much in race as we saw, but with gender, I mean, women were able to vote 3 years before men were because of communist ideology allowed that. There was abortion allowed for most of Soviet history. Marital rape was deemed illegal. 70 years before the United States deemed it illegal nationally. Similarly, with maternity leave, the United States has that for companies with 50+ employees. And finally, women served in combat roles throughout all of Soviet history, which essentially is probably why they won this, or were able to beat Hitler in the Second World War. The United States allowed women in their armed forces for about a century. They had some combat women. Well, women could be in combat only within this past decade. And now women are draftable, right? So if there is a draft, equal opportunity. That happened last year. None of you realized that. That's weird. John F. Kennedy was shot in November 22nd, 1963. Lyndon Johnson takes over. Our first telecommunications satellite. Now there's so many. That's how you're watching lots of things. That's how you stream things. That's how your phones work. But the first one was 1964. Okay, so we talked about Mercury, and we'll get back to Mercury as well. And we talked about Apollo. Now let's talk about the Soviet side. So we've already talked about Yuri Gagarin in Vostok 1 getting to space. They tried to up the ante by sending a much younger person into space, doing many more orbits, having more control. 64 orbits with Vostok 3 and 4. They did the first broadcast from space. There was a solo mission, first woman in space, which we talked about in the end of the last lecture. And then, because the Vostok was just the response to the Mercury mission, they had to completely retool it to make Voskhod, which was actually based on the same rocket. They didn't redesign it as much as the Americans did with Gemini. But they were able to take everything out of the capsule and squeeze multiple people in there. They didn't even give them spacesuits. In Voskhod 2, there's the first spacewalk. So a couple of videos I'll include in the description you should check out. So Voskhod 1, first multi-person crew, they were just crammed in there just to show that they could. At this period, Khrushchev is ousted. He'd been able to survive a previous ouster, but this time he's finally kicked out of leadership in the Soviet Union. He doesn't die, which is the first time in Soviet history that something like that happens. Oh, I love Russian history. Spacewalk, there's a video I'll include in the description. It's super, super duper scary. Leonov almost cannot get back inside. His spacesuit inflates. He's almost going to be the first person to die in space. And again, this happens to Buzz Aldrin in Gemini. This happens to Gene Cernan. This happens to a couple of people. The Soviets experienced it first and didn't tell anybody they had suffered this or how they'd managed to resolve these problems. See, extravehicular activity trouble, Gemini 12. Aldrin, yeah, first selfie in space. I guess we did get a famous first. Okay, so that was the Russian side. And the American side, we had several missions testing various maneuvers, multi-day flights, first spacewalk, first rendezvous attempt, did not work out. Gemini 5 attempted what's called a phantom rendezvous, just lining up in a certain spot and pretending like you were actually going to try to dock with another ship. Gemini 5 also spent 8 days in space. which was the amount of time needed to go to the moon and back, showing that it was possible. Gemini 6 and 7 docked. That was our first, several years after the Soviets managed to do theirs. So the United States wraps up 1966 with a couple of firsts, finally. Gemini 9, sadly, in one of the test runs, the pilots died, and so they were replaced by their backup crew. Gene Cernan had the problem that Leonov suffered of extravehicular activity. Nobody believed him until it happened to Buzz Aldrin again. Okay, I talked about all of these. These are just with more pictures. So I'll show you these shortly in class. These are the relative sizes of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Apollo, as you can see, is much bigger. But most of that is just to get the thrust to go to the moon, which is, as we saw, a quarter of a million miles away. So from Mercury to Gemini, a lot of things have changed. Mostly the United States finally seems like it's got its footing under it because it's putting money into it finally. But from Gemini to Apollo, many more things are going to change. The Soviet Union also had a plan for an Apollo mission. They were going to call it they were going to build this N-1 rocket, as you can see on the right. Much bigger than Sputnik or Luna or Vostok or even the Soyuz rockets. They never managed to get N-1 off the ground. They didn't have the machinery capability of building as big of the boosters as the United States was able to do. We had 5 rockets in the Gemini, in the Apollos. You can see there's these 5 thrusters at the very bottom of the Apollo shuttle. The Saturn V rocket. The Soviets can't do that, so they have more than 30 on the N-1 rocket, and getting those to coordinate, it turns out, is really hard. So there's lots of videos online of N-1 rockets exploding all over the place. Korolev has been working himself to death, basically. He's had a couple of heart attacks, and then he finally gives up the ghost and is replaced by Vasily Mishin, who is so much worse at his job. Just so much worse. So there's this transition period, and you can say that the United States, or the Soviet Union, loses its ground because they transitioned from Khrushchev and Korolev to Brezhnev and Mishin, who didn't care as much. That's certainly true. You could also say the United States started putting more money into the tasks of going to space. And so the Soviet Union didn't have enough resources to keep putting up the firsts. That's also true. Or you could just say that the first couple of tasks of getting into space were mechanically and engineeringly much simpler than later tasks. That's true as well. Perhaps you could blame the Soviet structure, that it was centralized as opposed to the distributed process that the Americans had, where they had universities and private companies building lots of their projects. Any of these would be interesting things to develop in an essay prompt on your exam, which you can take whenever you like. That is one of the questions, by the way. It's uploaded. In 1967, Apollo is practicing. They're practicing for Apollo's first mission to test out the Saturn V rocket. which is much, much bigger than the other rockets as we've seen. Gus Grissom, Chafee, White realize this rocket really sucks, and they complain about it constantly. There's just too many engineering problems. There's even a picture, this like official portrait, and they take another second picture where they're praying to the capsule, hoping that it will keep them alive. Grissom even hung a lemon on the inside of the capsule, arguing that it was a lemon. During a test, which, good God, the podcast gives you the actual sound of them dying. Ugh, sorry about that. There's an electrical short, and because the shuttle is pumped with a pure 100% oxygen, which is very flammable, within a couple of seconds, they all catch fire and die. This shutters the Apollo program for more than a year. And it's devastating for any of the people that were working in close proximity with these people, which were quite a few. The Soviet Union, not one to have any tact or let a good tragedy go to waste, decides to launch their Soyuz rocket, which is a much worse rocket than they let on. Yashin doesn't know what he's doing. Every one of the cosmonauts knows that it is a death trap, that anyone that goes up is going to die. And so Vladimir Komarov decides to volunteer to go up, because if he doesn't, his backup is going to be Yuri Gagarin, the most famous and important Russian cosmonaut, and he can't have him die. So Komarov volunteers to go test the Soyuz 1 rocket, knowing it's going to kill him. There are so many failures. It does get up into space, but the panels don't deploy, and then the communication systems aren't working. So many things fall apart. He manages to leave space successfully and come back down to Earth, and then the parachute doesn't deploy, and he swears, and he demanded to be buried in an open coffin to show the Soviet government what they had done to him. It's weird for his wife to have seen, but whatever. So this moment, which was going to be this big propaganda boost, ends up actually being a big failure for the Soviet Union. They suffer a very big disaster. The rocket turns out to be unusable. Their new chief designer, Mishin, is not trusted as much as Korolev was. They lose a cosmonaut to save the life of Yuri Gagarin, who dies a couple of months later in a car accident anyway. So that's 1967. Soyuz eventually did go up into space, and they managed to do some docking. They transferred their crew in 1968. They spent lots of time. They docked 3 separate ships. They spent 11 days in space. They had the first night launch. They launched a space station. So the United States likes to claim that we won the space race because we declared the moon as a target. The Soviet Union never agreed to that as the target. They did agree to the Sputnik target, right? The launching the first satellite along with the United States. I think they were trying to get to the moon. They just didn't want to accept the challenge for fear that they might lose. But their on paper goal for the 1960s was to launch a space station, which they did. in Salyut 1. Soyuz 11 finally manages to dock with a permanent space station. I'm going to use permanent in heavy quotes here. Because when they came back, it turned out that there was the word is escaping me, it's spacecraft for door, that opened. And one fun thing about liquids, well, actually all chemicals, all chemistry, is that the amount of pressure and the amount of temperature affects at what state water becomes a liquid or a gas. So if there's too little pressure, like say when you are in space and a hatch opens and the temperature's like a normal regular temperature, water boils. It literally boils at like any regular temperature. So if you happen to be 3 human beings whose blood is made mostly of water, your blood boils inside you instantly and kills you. And these are the only 3 people to have ever died in space. Salyut 1 did not have a second docking mission, and so it crashed. Salyut 2 failed. Salyut 3 was a military station with 1 successful docking. Salyut 4 was a civilian craft, docked 3 times. They tried again with 5 and 6 and 7. Finally, they launched Mir, which was by far the most successful one. Was only retired when the International Space Station was launched, which we'll talk about later. But I'm getting ahead of myself, right? I'm already hopping into the 80s. We need to go back to the timeline of Apollo 1 exploding and the Soviet version also exploding, Bondarenko crashing. 1968 is the first election after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and this is a complete realignment of American politics, the likes of which we've never seen. It's the most recent time when a third party won electoral college votes. That was George Wallace, famous segregationist, and Curtis LeMay, a man who desperately had tried to start World War III by trying to provoke the Soviet Union during the 50s. The Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey in a very contentious election where Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, after he had lost the primary during his State of the Union speech, spontaneously announces he's not running for re-election, which the networks did not realize was happening. They carried their reactions live, and it turned out the reaction was just like leaving their mouths agape. Richard Nixon runs for election again and finally wins this time with Spiro Agnew, the most, well, up until Donald Trump, the person who had the quickest political rise in American political history. Within 6 years, he had moved up from a mayor to the vice president. This is a complete realignment. The South goes to Dixiecrats, and then the next generation, or the next election, it goes to Republicans. The African-American vote is essentially locked up by the Democrats. Richard Nixon pursues what he calls a Southern strategy, bringing religious people into the fold, right? Up until this election, the Protestants and church leaders did not want to be involved in, white Protestants mostly, did not want to be involved in politics. They viewed it as dirty and having to make lots of concessions. politicians did not want religious people involved because they thought that it was hard to negotiate with somebody who thought that life and death wasn't the worst thing that could happen, that there was literally an eternity, true believers, true commitments. But Nixon thought that he could make a coalition between the religious right on social issues, the capitalist free market right on economic issues, and the anti-communist right on foreign policy issues. So that became the coalition of the Republican Party up until essentially Donald Trump in 2016. Well, we can talk about that at length on Wednesday. Yeah, so that's the 1968 election, probably the most important election of its time. Apollo missions finally started launching in '68 again, and Apollo had a couple of testing missions, Apollo 7, 8, 9, and 10. Apollo 8 I'll leave in the next slide because it's a really cool testing mission. Apollo 7 was the first one since the accident, and it turned out most things worked. So then they tried to go to the moon. Apollo 8 went around the moon. Jim Lovell went around the moon. And I'll post a link to them reading passages from Genesis as they circled the moon during Christmas Eve 1968. So NASA moved forward its timeline, and they made Apollos 9 and 10 some testing missions to make sure that they could, let's go back here, that they could launch the lunar module, that they could extract, that they could dock, that they could, they had good life support systems, that they could do everything that they needed. Apollo 10 got within a couple of kilometers of the moon to test that they could go down and back up if they wanted to, but they didn't actually touch down. Just gotta be sad. And then finally, we chose to get to the moon. We got to the moon and did the other things on July 20th, 1969. I'll post a link to that video as well. But Nixon had a contingency plan in case they hadn't made it and they had died, which was a genuine possibility. The space race, quote, ended, or at least it ended for the American side. Some people will draw the ending later at the Apollo-Soyuz mission, which was a rare moment of international unity, which I'll talk about in the next lecture. But that was it. We got to the moon. Yay.